Forced labour is any work or services that people are forced to do against their will under threat of some sort of punishment. It affects 20.9 million men, women and children around the world. It occurs most frequently in labour-intensive and unregulated industries such as agriculture, domestic work, construction, prostitution and other illegal activities. It usually occurs as a result of trapping the individual in debt bondage or restricting their freedom of movement. In other cases, violence, threats and intimidation are used. The highest rates are found in Asia and the Pacific, followed by Africa. Although it is a global problem, it can be found on our doorstep here in Ireland. In the last 6 years, the Migrants' Rights Centre Ireland has dealt with 180 cases, which is just the tip of the iceberg. Before 2008, there was no legal punishment for forced labour, therefore no justice for exploited workers.
What we do know is that the cases that are being identified at the moment by us or by other service providers are only a small percentage of what really is happening out there, because there are no resources, there are no ways of identifying victims, there's not enough outreach being done. So we can say that it is a growing problem, and even so we don't know it's very hard to estimate the actual size of the problem. But if we look at trends across the world, we know that it's a growing problem, that forced labour and trafficking in human beings is actually a very profitable money-making business, and that is an increase. So there's no reason to believe that Ireland would be any different than in the rest of the world. Well, forced labour is a situation in which a person finds himself or herself exploited, but unlike other forms of labour exploitation, there is an element of coercion and control, and while being exploited, the person gradually loses control over his or her own safety and privacy, and just gets deeper and deeper in the situation of exploitation. Generally, it can come with a form of debt bondage, or can it also be with threats, either of threats of deportation or threats of physical or emotional abuse to him or herself or the family. We can say from our experience, the majority of our cases have been in the domestic work sector and in restaurants. But we have also been have identified cases of people in the entertainment sector, such as circus, or people working as seafarers. But generally the most prominent sectors so far have been domestic work, particularly household of diplomats and people working in embassies, and also restaurants.
Migrant workers are employed across the board in Ireland. I think traditionally during the Celtic Tiger boom, we had an awful lot of migrant workers were in the hospitality restaurant industry, and they tend to be in sort of lower paid, low skill jobs, even though in our experience a lot of migrant workers would have their skills they'd be working way below their skill level. In the sort of forced labour sector, in our experience, we've come across a couple of people who've been working in domestic workers, so they've been working within a household, and people who've been working in the restaurant industry. Fortunately, in our experience, some of them, not always, with regard to people who've been victims of forced labour, we have come across some people who've been employed by members of their own community. And that's particularly disturbing, because within that, I think when migrant workers come into the state, they will automatically are sort of drawn towards working for people within their own community. So you have people who came from India who might be working with some in an Indian restaurant or in a takeaway. So these seem to be particular sites of exploitation. Now, I'm not saying that that's widespread throughout the country, that's just from our personal experience here. We've had a lot of people, so when you're talking about domestic workers, I think that's right across the board. There's a lot of kind of middle class white Irish families that are actually employing domestic workers and are using domestic workers as a form of exploited or forced labour. Agriculture again, so that's another sector that's rife with people who've been victims of forced labour. It tends to be around employers who would traditionally employ people on a casual or a kind of a very sort of a short-term basis.
In the domestic sector, for example, it would be there's high incidence in household of diplomats and embassy staff members, but also it could be just people using cheap labor for childcare, and particularly in the area of childcare, but also any form of domestic work. And they could be, it's actually not true to believe that they will all be foreign nationals. They are also Irish families employing migrants to do childcare. And the same thing for in restaurants and shops. The same. It could be there's a part of it which would be ethnic restaurants, but there's a part of it which is also local Irish restaurants.
I think in Ireland, like with most things, we've lagged behind. We lag behind in everything. If we compare ourselves to the EU, to say our nearest neighbour, to the UK, there are protections afforded there. Now, some of those have been eroded because of the new Tory government. So, like say for example, when the Liberal Democrats came in this year, one of their big things was that they wanted to have an earned regularisation scheme for undocumented workers. Now again, they've started to roll back on that. If you look at the US, in the US they've been fighting for years and years and years to bring some sort of legislation in to protect and to regularise undocumented workers. Now, it looks as if that's actually going to happen at the moment. But again, the length of time that it's taken has been huge. But at least, well, I suppose what's happening in the States is that that's always been an issue. It's always been very topical. So people are always talking about it. It's seen as, there's a lot of support behind it. And whereas in Ireland, we haven't really gotten to the point yet where we're even accepting that this is an issue.
In theory, Ireland has an effective legal system and national referral mechanism. However, its implementation is problematic. The main issue is that victims of forced labour aren't being formally identified by the state, therefore can't get access to these support structures.
I think the NGO sector has been the safety net, that we've been providing the safety net for people, because the immigration system is very complicated. If people run into difficulty with any form of immigration status, it's sort of human nature really. What you tend to do is people just tend to kind of ignore it or tend to sort of hide away. I think NGOs have always in Ireland traditionally been one of the very few sort of safety nets that are available to migrants, so that it will help them sort of get their residency, regularise their status, or whatever it is that needs to be done in that particular case. With regard to the state, no, I think the state has been very have not taken any form of responsibility really. It's very slow to get any kind of positive changes from the government. I think our immigration system is fundamentally flawed. I think we did have large numbers coming in that was kind of unprecedented at one time, and I think all the policies and legislation that was introduced was very kind of piecemeal and ad hoc. There was no sort of formal thinking about it. And then when things go wrong, which they inevitably will do when you have a system that's so based on discretion, the state it's very difficult for people to engage with the state to try and rectify their status.
Change our employment laws so that they take account of the fact that there may be workers who, for one reason or another, do not have a valid work permit or haven't been granted permission.
As long as you leave sectors without proper inspection and proper regulations, and that you don't really address the root causes of the demand and for cheap labour, the problem will continue to exist. So then the second issue is that once we identify labour exploitation, that has to be punished, and exploiters should be punished, and they should be made to pay compensation. And this is not only for traffickers or perpetrators of forced labour, but it's also for any other person who exploits migrants. So at the moment we have a problem in which undocumented migrants do not have access to the labour courts. So that just sends a very negative message, saying that you can exploit someone and nothing will happen to you.
One prominent case that the MRCI dealt with was that of Muhammad Younis from Pakistan. He was a victim of forced labour in Leak Slip, Kildare. For 2.5 years, he worked for a restaurant called Papadom, based in Dublin City.
I arrived in Ireland in September 2002. I decided to come to Ireland because my cousin owned a restaurant in Dublin and told me that I could get a job working in his restaurant. I worked there for 2.5 years. Most days I worked 4 p.m. until 12 a.m. and some days I worked from 4 p.m. until 3 a.m. I worked 7 days a week and the only day I got off was Christmas Day. In the 2.5 years I worked for my cousin, I was only paid €5,000. I told my cousin to renew my visa and they told me that they would renew it, but they didn't do anything about it. When I first left my job, I went to the MRCI, and from there I went to the Direct Provision Centre on Gardiner Street.
We managed to get Muhammad to come here the first time with his employer's wife, so it was very difficult to have a direct conversation with Muhammad because there was always an intermediary that was exerting some form of control. And then finally the second time he came by himself and we could speak to him and explain to him that if he was not happy in the situation of employment that he found himself in, that he could leave and that we could help him access and support, and eventually he left.
How was Muhammad's health when you first met him?
He looked very tired and very depressed, very sad, but he was very eager to get out.
Muhammad and the MRCI took their case to the Labour Court, who awarded Muhammad €92,000 in unpaid wages. Muhammad's employer then appealed this case to the High Court, challenging the authority of the Labour Court to rule in Muhammad's case because he was an undocumented worker. This undocumented status was out of Muhammad's control due to the fact his employer had withheld both his work permit and passport, leaving him with no choice but to work illegally. Therefore, he did not receive the €92,000 in unpaid wages. As of March 2013, Muhammad and the MRCI have filed an appeal to the Supreme Court. They are currently waiting for a hearing date to overturn the ruling from the High Court. If the case is overturned, Muhammad will get the full compensation he is owed. If it isn't overturned, they will then appeal the case to the European Court of Human Rights. If you think you know somebody trapped in forced labour, contact the MRCI so we can put an end to forced labour.